I'm Leanne Pomrenke, and this is What to Expect in a book club discussion of Embodied, Clergy Women and the Solidarity of a Mothering God, with thanks to Christ on Capitol Hill's Books and Brunch.
I feel like I've been missing so much of the Bible because no one had ever approached it from this view. And as soon as I read it in your book, I'm like, well, this just seems super obvious and important, and like it changes everything, like in a good way.
Reflection. Participants might reflect on how they were raised or how they parented, or are still actively parenting their own children.
After reading this, I thought, gee, I wish I'd known about this when my kids were younger, and I would have implemented more things maybe, or maybe it would have changed the way I responded to our children's angst, or some of the smart mouth stuff that you got sometimes that you wished you had bitten your tongue before you responded to them.
And then talk about how we're all made in God's image. And that's something that I feel like I've been talking a lot about with my daughters. How, oftentimes God is referred to as He, God the Father, but how we're all made in God's image. And God doesn't have a gender. But it is, I believe in the power of words, and over again, He, God the Father. And you made the point later in the book towards the end about how pastor is often, it's kind of become a male dominated word just because, that's the assumption we make, and how then that makes us think of God as more of the disciplinarian instead of like the nurturing, relational, mothering God. And I just love that. I've just been thinking about it so much. And it's something that I definitely want to drive home to our daughters too, that they're made in God's image, and that, God isn't necessarily male. I just appreciate how you reiterated that point throughout your book.
The whole purpose of parenting is to raise children then who become independent and go out into the world. And I think that is a metaphor fits with God developing within us the ability to reach out, and that's one of the purposes of the family, and then the growth outward.
Participants will talk about women's leadership in the church then and now, and so will the author if you invite her.
I was probably freshman, sophomore in high school. And the small country church, Western Minnesota, that came, it was a pair of missionaries from Pakistan. And he was the called person, and she came with the two children. But just, it opened my eyes so much to see what a female could do with theology and preaching and stuff. She would preach when he would be off someplace doing a missionary speech or whatever. And she was just so capable, so thoughtful. And it's like, women can do this too. We are God's children. And, there's no reason in the world why we can't be witnessing and talking about our faith with others, that, we have as much birthright to that as the males in our family or the males in our society.
That's why I appreciate, especially page 70, Leanne, where you talk about, like, if I'm working 20 hours, I will not volunteer 10 additional hours to set up the women's circle rummage sale. Or like, I'm not going to preach and then bring a pie. And there's very much that like blurring of boundaries with women in leadership versus men in leadership.
My hope is that we are extending abundant grace to our leaders. When you have been a parent yourself, I think you give more grace to your own parents for the ways that they parented you. Or if you are a teacher, then you feel more gracious towards your teachers, because we know the pressures that people are under. So hopefully that is one effect of acknowledging the weight. You'll examine the church is like a family metaphor.
like if we're going to use family, then it has to be like that family that always has extras at Thanksgiving, you know. Or like you have to talk about like, well, what type of family? Like the family that can do opposing views, or and not the family where you're silenced, you know. Or like you have to have like, I think, extra layers of interpreting.
I appreciated what you had to say about commitment to your church and choosing over and over again to belong. But then I thought you were also saying that then we can use that church, family, whatever you call it, to go out and do things in the world. That's part of what you think church should be encouraging us to do and supporting us.
And definitely dig into scripture and theology.
It's interesting because they're there. I mean, the scripture has not changed, obviously. But until someone points that out to you, we've learned scriptures and the Bible stories since we were little. And so until someone kind of puts that into your mind, I was really surprised at, once you have that in there and you read with this mothering image, how much more there is in there about the mothering image, and just not having it focused in your training and your education, you miss it, you know? So if you don't have someone that's putting that forward to look for those things, but once you do, to me, it seems so obvious that there are so many mothering, nurturing images and stories about that.
Something that I really appreciated was the idea of flexibility. I kind of grew up with a very authoritarian kind of viewpoint of God. And for all that my denomination really encouraged faith as being like a personal relationship, nothing felt very relational about it. And I struggled with reading that in the Bible. And so to think about God experiencing parenting for the first time also was like kind of revelatory to me. And even like from the beginning, when he talked about Adam and Eve and God making clothing for them as being an act of mothering, I mean, I had never interpreted any kind of like kindness or caring in that. I just was like, well, now God's mad, and God just stays mad. And so reading that made me realize how much I'd missed caring, especially in the Old Testament, because I wasn't thinking of it in that relational way, or that parenting way, or that learning or dealing with every situation differently because the children are different. I mean, I think that was really helpful too, and just being like, well, it's not inconsistent, it's just different scenarios call for different solutions. And so I found that really interesting to think about, and it just made me think like, I feel like I've been missing so much of the Bible because no one had ever approached it from this view. And as soon as I read it in your book, I'm like, well, this just seems super obvious and important, and like it changes everything, like in a good way.
Because my entire premise is that being a parent changes you. So if God is like a parent, then God can be changed in relationship with us. It's like the baseline of the metaphor for me. But there are people that will not accept that is, that's the end of the conversation right there. So I try to phrase things in ways where I'm not claiming this is how it is. I am recognizing that behavior is similar to behaviors I have done. I get into long, protracted bargaining arguments sometimes with my children. And look, God is doing that too. What does that mean? So that's my way of getting around the I am hereby proclaiming theology that people disagree with, because I don't know everything. And I'm not really a trained academic, but I know parenting, and I see it here. If this sounds like the discussion starter you could use, order at churchpublishing.org or wherever you buy books.